Canada stood directly in front of Donald Trump and clearly said that if America sets foot on Greenland, there will be war. This was not an ordinary diplomatic sentence. It was not part of a speech. It was not a statement given for the media. It was a red line, a line whose crossing would now mean only one thing for the entire world: confrontation. And at that very moment, alarms rang in every power center of the world, because for the first time, America's closest ally had openly stalked its president in clear words. Greenland, which until now seemed to people like a remote ice-covered region, suddenly became the center of global politics because it is the gateway to the Arctic, and the Arctic is the region where the energy, trade, and military power of the coming decades will be decided. There are vast reserves of oil and gas here, rare minerals without which modern technology cannot function at all, and new sea routes that can change the map of global trade. And Donald Trump sees all of this not through the lens of national sovereignty or international law, but like a business deal. For him, Greenland is not a home for people, but a strategic property, an asset which, if seized, would give America almost complete control over the Arctic. And this is the reason he had earlier spoken about buying it, which the world took as a joke, but in reality it was a warning, because history bears witness that powerful leaders first joke and then attack. But this time, contrary to his expectations, Canada stood in front of him, a country that for a long time had been considered to stand in America's shadow, that often spoke in soft language and avoided confrontation. But now that same Canada was saying that if Greenland is attacked, it would not only protest but would stand at the military level as well. And this statement was not given into empty air. Behind it were rapidly forming global alliances. Canada had already increased contact with countries like Germany, the Nordic nations, and Brazil. Discussions were underway on joint military exercises in the Arctic, and a series of emergency meetings had begun within NATO because Greenland is part of Denmark, and Denmark is a NATO member. America is also a NATO member, and if America attacks Greenland, it would be attacking a member of its own alliance, which would activate NATO's Article 4 and then Article 5, which means collective defense. That is, all NATO countries would be obligated to help the country that has been attacked, even if the attacker itself is America. And this is the legal and strategic trap that the Trump administration both fears and wants to break. Because if NATO rules are applied, America would stand before the world as an aggressor, and its moral and political credibility would suffer a deep blow. But on the other hand, Trump's entire political model is based on this very confrontation. He always creates some enemy or the other, sometimes China, sometimes Mexico, sometimes Europe, and now Greenland, so that he can show his supporters that he alone is fighting against the entire system, while in reality he wants to break that very system for his personal benefit. And in this process, international law, treaties, and the sovereignty of small countries all get sacrificed. That is why Canada did not step back this time, because it knows that if silence is maintained today on Greenland, tomorrow it will be some other country. Perhaps Iceland, perhaps some African or Latin American country, or even Canada's own Arctic regions. Because in Trump's thinking, borders are not sacred, only deals are. And for this reason, Canada has now declared itself not just America's neighbor, but the protector of the rules-based global order. It is increasing its military presence in the Arctic, making agreements on energy security, and signaling that democracy is not protected by words alone, but by strength and unity. This entire crisis has shaken Europe as well, because for the first time since the Second World War, it feels like America, once the pillar of the democratic order, could now become the biggest threat to that very order. Germany, France, and the Nordic countries understand that if NATO's principle that no member will attack another breaks down, then the security of all of Europe will be in danger. And this is why they are now openly signaling that they stand with Canada. Meanwhile, Trump is trying to portray this as a display of nationalist strength on his social media platforms and at rallies. But at the global level, it is being seen as a dangerous gamble, because if the world's largest military power itself starts breaking rules, then no international order can survive. And this is the turning point where history often descends into darkness. Canada and its allies are trying to stop this, because they know that this is not just a question of Greenland, but a question of the idea of whether the world will still be governed by law or by force. And at the center of this struggle today stands an ice-covered island that could define the future of all humanity for years to come. As this crisis deepened, the world slowly began to realize that the Greenland issue had become not just a test of one island, but a test of the entire global power structure. Because if a country like America can openly set its sights on the land of a NATO member, then no treaty, No agreement and no international rule have any value left. And this is the fear being felt in every European capital, from Berlin to Paris and from Oslo to Copenhagen. Everyone knows that if Trump is not stopped at Greenland today, tomorrow he will try to impose his will on the rest of the Arctic, and then beyond that as well. Because the core principle of his politics is that the powerful is the one who can exert the most pressure, even if it means pushing the world into chaos. That is why Canada is not just issuing statements, but is quietly and very rapidly working on its strategy. Military bases in the Arctic are being modernized, radar and surveillance networks are being shared with Nordic countries, and joint defense plans are being discussed with Germany and France. Because everyone knows that if a confrontation happens, it may not remain only diplomatic, but could reach the military level as well. On the other side, Trump's team is viewing this entire situation as a domestic political game. They know that by creating the image of an external enemy, they can keep their supporters united and divert attention from internal accusations against them. That is why Greenland has become the perfect weapon for them, an issue they can link with nationalist emotions and claim that America is reclaiming its power and dominance. But in this game, they forget that every step on the international stage has a reaction, and that reaction has now begun to appear. Countries like Brazil, which earlier stayed away from such issues, are now openly talking with Canada because they fear that if the rules-based order breaks, big countries will crush small ones. Latin America already has bitter memories of American intervention, and no one wants that history to return in a new form. Meanwhile, the United Nations and other international institutions are also under pressure, because if conflict erupts within NATO itself, the foundation of global diplomacy will shake. That is why behind the scenes, a series of emergency meetings and secret negotiations is underway, where everyone is facing the same question. Can Trump be stopped? Or will the world have to prepare for an era where force alone becomes law? Amid this confusion, the people of Greenland themselves are also worried, because they do not want to become pawns in the fight of great powers. They want to protect their culture, their land, and their future. But in the politics of big countries, the voices of small people often get suppressed. And this is the moral crisis that makes this entire issue even more serious. Because this is not just a battle between states, but also a question of the lives of ordinary people who pay the price for these decisions. That is why Canada's insistence on not backing down is gradually becoming a symbol, a signal that there are still some countries that place rules and principles above power, no matter how great the risk may be. And this is the struggle that will determine the direction of the world in the coming days. Because if this alliance breaks under Trump's pressure, it will send the message that democracy and law are only for the weak. But if they hold firm, it may prove that even today, collective willpower can be greater than the ambition of any one individual. At this point, the world has also begun to understand that the Greenland crisis will not remain limited to the Arctic or NATO's boundaries, but could become a spark that ignites many old and suppressed conflicts at once. Because when a superpower openly breaks rules, other countries also start looking for opportunities to settle their old scores. That is why China, Russia, and many players in the Middle East are watching this entire development very closely. They know that if America stands against its own alliance, a major vacuum will be created in the global balance of power. And history shows that such vacuums always give birth to new conflicts. Canada and Europe understand this danger, and therefore they are trying to unite not only to stop Trump, but to save the entire system. Because the international framework built after the Second World War was based on the principle that no country can single-handedly crush the sovereignty of others through sheer force, but Trump's politics directly challenges that principle. He believes that if America is the most powerful, it does not need to follow rules, and this thinking is pushing the world toward instability. Meanwhile, a deep divide is also forming within the American public. Many people are uncomfortable with this aggressive policy, knowing that it could end in endless wars and economic crisis. But Trump's hardcore supporters see it as national pride and dismiss any criticism as treason. The Trump administration is taking advantage of this internal division, because when a country is divided from within, it becomes easier to exploit external conflict. Greenland has become the new front of this game, where every statement, every military exercise, and every diplomatic meeting sends a message. Defense budgets are being increased in European cities, surveillance flights in the Arctic are rising, and cybersecurity has been put on high alert because in today's world, wars are not fought only with tanks and missiles, but also with data and networks. All of this is preparation for a situation where even a small mistake could turn into a major confrontation. Canada's role becomes especially important here because despite being so close to America, it is now choosing a different path. It is showing that Being a neighbor does not mean blind loyalty, but also the responsibility to stand on principles. That is why many small and medium-sized countries have begun to see Canada as a moral leader. They know they do not have America's military power. But if one country can stand openly, they can at least offer diplomatic support. In this entire scenario, Greenland itself has become a symbol, showing how a remote and sparsely populated region can become the center of global politics when future power is hidden within it. And this is the irony that the people who lived peacefully on that land for centuries are now trapped between the ambitions of big countries. Their wishes, their culture, and their future often get lost somewhere in these discussions. But this crisis reminds us that decisions in international politics ultimately affect human lives, not just maps and numbers. And therefore, this confrontation is not just about strategy, but also about morality. Because if the world accepts that powerful countries can claim any territory whenever they want, then what meaning will remain for the existence of small societies? And in answer to this question, Canada and its allies justify their position. They say that this fight is not just for one island, but for the idea that every country, no matter how small, is the owner of its own future. And that idea is what is at stake on the global stage today. As this crisis dragged on, it also became clear that for Trump, Greenland is not just a question of strategic gain, but also of personal power and image. Because his entire political life has been built on presenting himself as a leader who can break any opposition, any rule, and any tradition. That is why he is using this confrontation as a show of strength in domestic politics, claiming that America is being made strong again, even if it means intimidating its own allies. But the biggest weakness of this thinking is that it ignores long-term consequences. Because if America loses trust with its friends today, tomorrow when it truly needs help, no one will stand with it without hesitation. And this fear is deeply felt in both Europe and Canada. They know that if this bond of trust breaks, the entire Western world could fragment. Meanwhile, the debate among media and the public is also intensifying. Is Trump really increasing the country's security? Or is he putting it in unnecessary danger? Because with every military move, economic uncertainty also rises. Investors are nervous, energy markets are becoming unstable, and global trade is beginning to feel the impact. Rising tension in a remote region like Greenland does not mean just a local problem, but pressure on the entire global economy. This is the aspect many ordinary people have not yet fully realized, but slowly an understanding is forming that this confrontation could affect every country's kitchen, because war or warlike situations always mean inflation, shortages, and insecurity. That is why many international organizations are quietly trying to reduce this crisis. They are facilitating behind-the-scenes talks, searching for compromises, and trying to explain to the Trump administration that this path will isolate them. But in Trump's style, backing down is seen as weakness. And this stubbornness is making the entire crisis even more dangerous. Because when one person places their image above the stability of the world, the consequences are often destructive. Canada is therefore continuously sending the message that this is not about personal hostility, but about rules and balance. They want to show that democratic countries can be firm without being aggressive. And this is the subtle but crucial difference that defines this conflict. Because this is an opportunity to prove whether civilized nations can collectively stop a leader who wants to bend the entire system to his will. And this test now stands before history. And now, as this crisis stands at its most delicate point, the entire world is almost holding its breath to see what the next step will be, because very few moments in history come when the direction of the future rests on a single decision. And this Greenland confrontation has become exactly such a moment, where in front of Trump stands not just an island, but the entire international order. An order that for decades has functioned on the principle that even the powerful are subject to rules. But if this principle breaks today, then no country, no matter how small, will be able to feel safe. That is why Canada and its allies appear ready to take this fight to the end. They know that backing down would not just mean losing Greenland, but losing the idea that the world can be governed by law. That is why they are taking risks, pouring in resources, and staking their political capital, so that the message goes out that democracy is not just a play of words, but a real commitment. And the greatest irony of this entire story is that the America which once played the biggest role in creating this rules-based order now appears determined to break it under its own leadership. But history also tells us that no system ever depends on one person alone. People, institutions, and allies ultimately try to restore balance. And perhaps that is the hope still shining in this darkness, that no matter how tense the situation becomes, the world will not completely surrender to madness. because ultimately this conflict is not just about Greenland or Trump, but about the question of what kind of world we want to live in. A world where every country lives under fear, or a world where rules, respect, and cooperation still matter. And that is the decision that will be written in the pages of history after this crisis, whatever the outcome may be.